Okay, hi everyone, my name is Bree, and I'll be doing my thesis presentation called Canterbury to the Cloud, How the Inventions of the Printing Press and the Internet have affected our culture and our language. So I've always been interested in the idea of language, and not just the books and the stories that come out of it, but also language itself and how it changes and how it affects us, our culture, and how we're able to communicate across cultures. Actually, the arrow. So for my thesis, I focus on the relationship between language, technology, and culture, and I researched two technologies that have had a profound impact on our language and culture, the printing press and the internet. So I found that the relationship between these technologies and the English language and our culture is cyclical. Technology affects language, language reflects culture, and culture is changed by technology. For my presentation, I'll be looking at these three aspects of the relationship with both the printing press and the internet. So the printing press affected language by standardizing it. William Caxton was the first printer in England to use the movable type invented by Gutenberg. And at the time Caxton was printing books in English, he was the first one to do so in the vernacular English. And there were many variations of English being spoken, like dialects across England. And these dialect differences had made it difficult for a standard written English to be established before the printing press. Printers like Caxton couldn't print books in multiple dialects. That would have been too expensive and not very efficient. So instead, language used in the printed books reflected the dialect spoken by the people who were most likely to buy those books. So that is primarily the wealthy of London. Were the ones most likely to buy the books, and that's why their dialects became the standard for everywhere. So to look at how the printing press has affected language, I compared two versions of the Canterbury Tales. Caxton has printed a version in 1476, about 100 years after it was written by Chaucer. And then there's a 1483 printed edition also written, and that one reflects Chaucer's original language because someone had complained to Caxton about his inaccurate version. So he printed a new one reflecting Chaucer's language. So we can see in Caxton's version, like I pulled out a word, April. We can see that spelling is a lot more recognizable to us today than Chaucer's version from 100 years previously. So language and spelling changed in that 100 years, but with the standardization of the printing press, we're still recognizing that spelling, that April spelling. So yeah, even though this one was printed in 1483, it reflects Chaucer's language from 100 years earlier. So language reflects and in some ways contributes to the cultural changes that were happening at the time as well. So the structured language that was forming reflects a more structured society that was emerging with the social class structures. So there were clear class distinctions forming, and this was reflected in the language. So the kind of rough dialect versions of language that had been more prominent before the printing press were still being used and written about, but they were being written about with like the peasants or the lower class. They were given those dialects, whereas the elite classes were given the more standardized dialect that was being formed with the printing press. So in that way it contributed to the class distinctions that were forming. And then also having a printed work in English, in the vernacular spoken language of a lot of people, contributed to and reflected the growing sense of national unity that was occurring. So Englishmen were distinctly English now, not only by their customs, but also by their language. And then also the language of the English court at the time was French, and it eventually did become English. So that is one of the gradual effects of the printing press. It didn't happen right away, but it did happen. So culture is changed by the printing press in two main ways. There was a lot of ways, obviously, but we have time to talk about them in my presentation. So two of them are higher literacy rates and more comparative scholarship. So literacy rates rose because more books were being printed and the price went down. And because the price went down, a lot more people were able to afford buying books. And so literacy rates rose with that. So obviously, there were still the lower classes that weren't able to buy these nicely printed books, but they were printing like penny books, so really cheap versions, not a lot of which survived because of the very cheap quality of like the paper and that kind of thing. But in that way, literacy rates rose because people had more access to literature. And then also scholarship changed. So whereas before the printing press, a lot of people couldn't afford multiple volumes of books, and now that they could, there was more comparative scholarship going on between the classic texts that resulted in new scholarship and also between new scholarship. So as Elizabeth Eisenstein writes, new intellectual combinations were happening, and she's a prominent scholar on the effects and repercussions of the printing press on our language and culture. So all these changes and repercussions we've seen with the printing press, we can also see a little bit now with the internet. So our language, the internet's affecting our language by really reversing that standardization that the printing press kind of put on language. So like social media like Twitter and Facebook are giving people a lot more opportunity to write and publish things immediately. And this reflects this idea of spoken language. So with speech, when we say something, it's out there, it's published. We don't have time to like edit for grammar or something like that, which like traditional publishing had that ability. So now with social media, we're able to almost mimic that spoken way of like publishing words. And so this is, I have a Facebook post here by my cousin, and you can see that she's not really interested in the traditional spelling or grammar rules. She just wants to get her thoughts out there. So there's obviously a lot of debate whether it's worth getting all these thoughts out there, because not a lot of them are that important, but we're still able to do it. And then this over here is a quote from a book called Twitterature, and that is, that is these two, actually they were college age students, and they took these classic works, and this one's from Macbeth, and they wrote them in 20 or less tweets and published all these in a book. So this you can see we're using that reflection of spoken language, and that's showing in our writing. So we're using like capital letters and punctuation and symbols to reflect our like voice inflections and the intonation in our voice. So that's being affected on written language. So culture is changed by the internet, and obviously a number of ways as well. But one of which is the disintegration, language reflects our culture. So the globalization of our world in business and in tourism, and the ability to travel and talk with each other all over the world is now reflected in the globalization of our language. In English in particular, because of our high presence online, we are becoming very prominent in business and tourism. A lot of people are wanting to learn English, and also because of the nature of our language, we're able to take things from other languages and kind of assimilate them and use them in English as well. And then also the casual and spoken nature of our language now reflects the more casual nature of our culture as well. And the internet has enabled us to do that. So now our culture is changed by technology. One of the ways is the disintegration of some cultural barriers. And obviously there are still forms of racism and still cultural stereotypes that do exist. Those have not gone away. But the internet has enabled us to communicate more easily across cultures, assuming, of course, that the culture has a lot of access to internet, so not everybody does. But because of that increased communication, some of those barriers are breaking down. So we're able to talk to other people from different cultures and realize that some of the perceptions we have are wrong. And then another thing is we can communicate and react and share our feelings a lot more instantly with the internet and with social media like Twitter. And like with the Boston Marathon bombings, people were posting pictures online like as they were happening, and they were tweeting and like asking, if you've seen this family member, all these different things. And actually Google created a Google Docs that people were writing their names and where they were so family members could find each other. And that's something that even 12 years ago with 9/11, we weren't able to do that. We were just able to really watch on the TV and maybe donate money. But this, we're able to be a lot more, like people across the nation were able to participate in this and help people get through this. So in conclusion, I'm arguing that the relationship between technology and language and culture is a cyclical one, each affecting and really relying on the other to grow and change. The printing press and the internet have changed the way we communicate and in turn changed our cultures. This culture change is reflected in our language. We live in a different world now than even 20 years ago with the internet. And this change is because of this increased ability to communicate with the internet. Like the printing press, the effects of the internet on our culture and our language are huge, and we shouldn't be trying to reject these new types of communication or language, but instead we should be asking, what's next?